Hi everyone, Simon from Horoma Studio. So as you may know, I'm mainly interested in stuff like composition and image theory and sort of like psychology of perception. And in the last masterclass that I did, there was one of the students that had a very interesting remark that led to question very simple tips that we tend to hear all the time from like blogs or even artists in general. These two tips that I want to question today is this idea that you should work in black and white to settle your composition. And also the other one is this idea that you should flip your canvas every now and then to double check your composition. And as we'll see, these two little tips actually carry very strong perception issues that most people, I think, are unaware of. So basically, that's what I want to discuss today. The idea is that I'll go through one tip one by one, and it should be quite straightforward, hopefully, but hopefully it will be the sort of like eye-opener for some artists, because the idea is to really put more mindfulness on the sort of like stuff that happen in your brain when you look at different types of image, and how hopefully I think we can sort of fix the kind of frustration that we can sometimes have when we look at like the original version and the new version and we don't exactly understand why one is better than the other. So yeah, let's have a look at that today. So first tip that we all hear about is this idea that you should work in black and white to settle composition. You might have actually heard it from me as well, because I tend to do that. And some times ago, because before I actually started working on my course, I was a little bit less aware of what was happening. Nowadays, I would have like a little bit of more nuances to add on like this idea of working in black and white. So basically, what you need to understand is that this idea that there's what basically happens when you start working in black and white in an image is that you, well, literally take away all the color information. So anything related to hue and saturation is gone from your image, and you're looking at an image that is in black and white. The thing that is actually something you need to understand, and that we sometimes kind of forget, is that depending on the image you're working on, the information of color can actually completely shift the type of image you're building or working on. So let's have a look at a couple of examples so that you can better understand what I mean by that. Two examples I want to show you to sort of demonstrate the idea. First one here is we have a painting by Joseph Wright of Derby. As you can see here, the version is in black and white. We have, if we look at this image, we have this idea of like a sort of like a greatest everywhere contrast happening here, which sort of like catches the eye very quickly. We have, if we just look at values, basically, because we can't look at anything else. We have a pretty dark area here. This is slightly, what's the word? Brighter here, etc. You have a sort of like a fog or like aerial perspective, etc. But the overall image seems to center or revolve around the moon here. So this is pretty interesting. Even though we start to notice some details here, the value that they have and the type of contrast that we have here is very low, which means that we're still more interested in this area. If we put this image in color, what happens is that there's a lot of information that starts to happen again, because we have very strong color here and a strong color contrast with the rest of the image. Here is like very low color contrast, where everything is kind of like monochrome in a way. We're still like playing with different tints. Whereas here we have a completely different hue. And like the title of the image, actually I forgot the exact title, well, this is the Vesuvio. So a volcano that is sort of like erupting here. And you can see that between this image and this image, the way you read the image is completely different. There's like a complete shift from looking at this in the black and white version to actually looking at this in the colored version. So this basically is very important and has like a complete shift in composition. If we look at another example, it's a photograph by Julius Schulman, which is one of my favorite photographer. If you don't know him, you have to look into his work. It's very interesting. Here you have a very, I was going to say basic photo, but it's not a basic photo because there's a lot of details that makes it interesting, but still, you have sort of like a domestic scene of something pretty basic, let's say like mundane or like the day-to-day stuff, with like a mother and her child, and like you have a chair here, and everything's pretty simply composed with an interesting perspective point, etc. Very simple. And the thing is that in black and white, you have like interesting contrast between the inside and the outside. you still have like a lot of weight given on the kid here because he's in between dark elements. It's a human in the sense that it actually catches a lot of attention to other humans, which is us. You have the woman looking at him and the child looking back, etc. So there's a lot of interaction. What is interesting is that if you start putting the image in black and white, in a color, sorry, you have additional stuff happening in terms of perception, in terms of relatability. Is that you have the flowers here that are exactly the same color as the yellow chair here that are actually the same color as the other flower pots here, or a bouquet, whatever. And this actually, in terms of the way you're going to read the image, if you look at this image like this, you kind of really don't care much about this chair, except that the fact that it's framed by this actual window. But if you look at it in color, it actually completely shifts because you have this sort of, I remember I did like a video on Gestalt theory. So this is like this idea of like similarity and like how we can relate those elements together just because of the color. But we can't do that in black and white, of course, because their value is actually different. So these two examples sort of like exemplify, I think, this idea of how important color is sometimes in composition. So the basic takeaway from this is that working in black and white shouldn't be a sort of like automatism anytime you work on an image. The idea is that every time your composition is value-based, so you know that most of your colors is not going to be that interesting or important in the actual image, and that there's going to be a palette that is very like minimal, then you can actually start working in black and white and work on your values. If, on the other hand, you are working on a project where like the composition is kind of like color-based, where basically some colors will completely shift the way you read the image, and that way, in that like scenario, I think it's really important to start working in color as soon as possible, because otherwise there might be a complete shift in composition and the way you read the image as soon as you switch from black and white to color. And if the final image is in color, but you've spent most of your time doing it, making it work in color, in black and white, sorry, then you might have issues. On to the second tip that we often hear, which is this idea of flipping the canvas in your composition. We've all had this sort of like eureka moment at school, or architecture school, when you sort of like flip your tracing paper and you're suddenly like, oh my God, this project works way better than the previous one. This kind of applies sometimes to illustration as well. To be perfectly fair, there's like two ways of understanding this idea of flipping the canvas. One is actually interesting. The thing is that sometimes people push it a little bit further and then it actually doesn't make sense anymore. So why generally do people talk about this idea of flipping the canvas? This relates to this concept that's called like mere exposure effect. That basically means that the longer you work on an illustration or whatever, the more you'll feel like it's actually a good thing. Like the more you'll feel like the illustration looks good, even if it actually maybe doesn't. It's just the fact that you've been exposed too long on the same element and you actually don't even see the mistakes anymore. The other thing that we basically that stems from that is that you can actually usually fix proportions and fix like issues of balance, etc. in your image, thanks to this sort of like resetting the mere exposure effect. I'll start with the wrong way of understanding this concept that people tend to use and say that you need to flip your canvas in order to check your composition, and normally your image should work just the same in one way or another. And the problem is it's psychologically completely wrong for many reasons. I'm going to expose a couple of them. The first one is that basically we have, our vision is hardwired to work in sort of like landscape mode and to read from left to right. It has nothing to do with culture, it's just the way our brain works. And it's very interesting because it has a lot of consequences. The first one that has been sort of discovered by a historian, what's called art historian, sorry, Heinrich Wölfflin, that basically said that the fact that we have this sort of like left to right way of reading images means that we have ways of reading diagonals and that we can see them as ascending and descending. And one thing that was interesting is that he basically went as far as saying that the fact that we flip some image and the fact that we actually read from left to right and read diagonals as ascending or descending has an impact on how we perceive them. And he went as far as saying that if we flip like classical paintings or Baroque paintings, they actually lose their meaning, which is actually not far from the truth. Let's have a look at a couple of examples to show you the difference in both flipped image. Here, so actually this one. Here is a original painting by Delacroix called Christ Asleep During the Tempest. This one is very interesting because there is like a very strong diagonal that we call in a dynamic symmetry, that I'll do a video about dynamic symmetry probably like later this month or whatever, called the sinister diagonal. And basically the idea is that the orientation of this diagonal has a sort of negative perception. And what it means is that basically if you flip the image, you actually don't even read the image the same way. This has to do with the fact that basically the idea of starting from high to go low has a sort of negative, and like this idea of descending, whereas the actual, like the way we would read it if we flip it is that we're actually going from the lower part and going up, which has this sort of ascending motion that is like more positively perceived. And also you have, just in terms of how the things are organized in terms of values, you can see that you have much darker areas here and much brighter dark areas here. And in the actual version, you can see that we actually go from brighter to dark. And if you go from bright to dark or dark to bright, you can imagine that the way you read the image and the way you perceive and understand the image is actually different. So thinking that you can actually make this image work exactly the same as the flipped image is actually completely impossible because of the way we actually read the image. Another simpler example that I think is interesting is regarding this little photograph. It's a very simple photograph. Well, I mean, like it's a pretty advanced one, but in terms of like subject, it's very simple. What we're interested in is this idea of the diagonal here and how flipping this little diagonal actually completely changes the way we read the image. If we look at this image like this, knowing that we read from left to right, kind of, you basically perceive this motion as an opening, and you're sort of like brightening the image and brightening your perception and opening onto something, because generally we read from left to right, we have this idea of like past and future, etc., and negative and positive. So here you have this idea of opening onto something. If we flip the image, the perception is completely different, because instead of going like that and going up and having like, having this understanding of opening the image, we do the opposite and we sort of close it. So you can see that the orientation of this diagonal has a completely different way of making us read the image. And here you have like this idea of something more enclosed, more possibly like intimate, etc. So there's like a lot of like impact in how your diagonals are oriented. And basically this will mean that there's a lot of impact on how you present your image. And thinking that you can actually make this image work the same way you will make this image work is actually completely counterintuitive, because, or plainly wrong, because there are two different compositions. They're the same image in the sense that in terms of information on it, it's the same, but in terms of composition and perception, they're completely different. They're like almost opposed, or like opposite, sorry. Thinking that we can, or we have to make those two images work is actually something you will never achieve, because they're just different. One thing though is that really they are different. There's no like better or worse version. They're just very different in the way you perceive them. And you have to be aware of these differences in order to be able to actually choose which scenario between the original or the new one you actually prefer, and sort of conveys what you're after. Now on to the other version of that tip that could be a bit more interesting, which is more related to the mere exposure effect. It's that the idea, instead of flipping the image and working on it and making it work and then flipping and having like them being similar, which is impossible, the idea is just to flip it several times in order to refresh the way you look at your image, and also to sort of like understand what are the, like refresh the perception that you have of your image in order to better understand what's happening. Because if you refresh, like if you flip it several times, instead of flipping it just once and working on the image, which is not something you should do, you will then have a better understanding of how's the distribution of weights in your image, how are the tensions working. Maybe there are areas that are a little bit too dark or a little bit too bright, etc. And this you can actually really benefit from flipping your canvas. One thing, again, that I might have said, but I'm going to repeat it, that you shouldn't do is to flip your image and work on the image that is flipped. Because what happens when you work on the flipped image is that you're creating new tensions, but the thing is that they don't linearly translate back once you flip it again. So maybe you'll be like recreating better dynamics in the flipped version and thinking it's actually okay. But if you flip it back again, the way you read it, since it's actually flipped as well, because you still read it the same from left to right, it means that maybe some dynamics that you thought were working actually are not working anymore because they are flipped, but you're still reading from left to right. Don't know if it's that clear, but still, that's the essence of it. So what you want is really just to refresh your look on the image, but you don't want these two images to become identical because it just is impossible. So yeah, basically, whenever this sort of like perception issues come up, I think it's very important to take a step back and very accurately analyze what is happening when you're like using this sort of like small tips, because we tend to think that they're very simple things. But the thing is that I know from experience that it leads to a little bit of frustration when you have like a very nice looking black and white image and you turn it in color and you're like, actually, there's something wrong with it. And it comes from the fact that colors have their own weight and that sometimes they don't actually translate between values and colors because colors have different types of saturation depending on their values, etc. And also regarding the flip thing, I know that I used to try to use this tip, and sometimes I personally don't use it that much because I find it very, I've had too long time finding it very disturbing. I've finally sort of understood why, but still, I tend to use it very, very rarely, to be perfectly honest. As I said in the intro, I tend to be very interested in this type of topic, so I've developed much more and thorough examples, practical examples, theoretical examples about this in the masterclass that I'm running on composition. So if you ever want to have a better understanding of all these topics, I will be happy if you go on the landing page to check this out. I'm currently refining the content of this, so it's taking much longer than expected. So I'm hoping to make the next cohort early next year, but there will be much more new content than there was on the previous cohort. So this should be pretty fun, I hope. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting and kind of like have a little bit more mindfulness on how you might have been using those tips until now, and maybe you'll get like a little bit less frustrated if you understand how they kind of translate from black to white in color and the flip version, how this works. Anyway, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.